Ah, you wish to hear of the Ents, do you? The shepherds of the trees, the ancient ones who walk where others cannot follow, who speak in voices like wind through forgotten valleys. Very well, very well. Draw closer to the fire, for this is a tale that stretches back to the very dawn of this world, before the sun and moon walked their appointed paths, before the first elves opened their eyes beneath the stars of Varda. You see, to understand the Ents, you must first understand something of the nature of Middle-earth itself. This world was sung into being, shaped by music and thought and the divine fire of creation. And when the Valero's great powers who serve Alvetar came into this world to prepare it for the coming of the children, they brought with them spirits. Countless spirits of every age and temperament, some mighty and some small, some bound to fire, others to water, still others to stone and earth and growing things. The Maya we are called, those of us who serve the greater powers. I am one such spirit. Though I have walked so long in this form of flesh and bone that sometimes even I forget what it was to exist pure thought and will. But there are other spirits, older in their binding to this world, who took forms more ancient still, and among the most remarkable of all these were the spirits who became the Ents. Now, the trees of Middle-earth are not as the trees of other worlds might be. They remember. Oh yes, they remember everything. Every sunrise that warmed their leaves, every storm that bent their branches, every creature that sheltered beneath their boughs. The oldest trees remember the time before time, when the world was lit only by the light of the two trees of Valinor, that silver and golden radiance, that was the first true light to shine upon creation. And some trees grew so old, so filled with memory and slow, patient wisdom, that they began to wake. But waking is one thing, walking is quite another. It was Yavanna, she who is called the giver of fruits, the queen of the earth, who first foresaw the danger. You must understand, Yavanna loves all growing things as a mother loves her children. The grasses of the fields, the flowers of the meadows, the great trees of the forests, all these are her creations, her joy, her sorrow. And she knew with a mother's terrible foresight that when the children of Alvetar came into the world, they would cut and burn and fell. They would use axe and fire without thought, without mercy, without understanding what they destroyed. So Yavanna went to Man, the elder king, lord of the winds and ruler of Arda, and she wept before him. She spoke of her children, the trees and the growing things, and how they could not flee or fight, how they stood helpless before those who would harm them. And Man listened, for he is wise and his heart holds compassion for all things that live. He spoke with Alvetar, the one who is above all, and the answer came back like thunder across the mountains. Spirits would be summoned, spirits would be given form. The trees would have their shepherds, their guardians, their protectors. And so the Ents came into being. Imagine, if you can, what it must have been like. The world was young, so young that the stars were still finding their places in the sky. The great forests stretched unbroken from sea to sea, and in those forests the trees grew to heights that would seem impossible now. And walking among them came the first Ents, shaped like trees themselves but alive in a different way, awake and aware, with eyes that gleamed with ancient wisdom and voices that rumbled like distant thunder. Treebeard, whom I have known for many ages of this world, once told me those earliest days. His name in the old Entish tongue is Fangorn, which means bird of tree, and he is the oldest of all the Ents who still walk in Middle-earth. When he speaks of the beginning, his voice grows soft, so as leaves falling in autumn. And there is a light in his eyes like sunlight through green canopy. He told me that in the beginning, the Ents knew nothing of themselves. They walked in the forests, and they tended the trees, and they spoke in languages that no other creature could understand. The old Entish tongue is the most ancient language still spoken in Middle-earth, and it is a language without haste, without urgency. A single word in old Entish might take hours to speak properly, for the Ents do not believe in hurrying anything. Why should they? They have seen mountains rise and fall. They have watched rivers change their courses over thousands of years. A day, a year, even a century, what is that to an Ent? But the Ents were lonely in those early days. They walked alone, each tending their own part of the forest, and though they would sometimes meet and speak in their slow, rumbling way, they felt something was missing. It was the elves, the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, who changed everything. The elves awoke far to the east, beside a great lake under stars that were newly kindled, and when they began to spread across the world, they came eventually to the great forests where the Ents walked. Now, the elves have always loved trees, for they are creatures of starlight and growing things, and they understand the patience of the green world in a way that mortal men rarely do. When they first encountered the Ents, they were not afraid. Instead, they were curious, delighted, enchanted by these strange walking trees who spoke in voices like wind and water. And the elves taught the Ents to speak, not Odentish, which the Ents had always known, but the languages of the elves themselves, Quenya and Sindarin, and the other tongues that were spoken in those distant days. And with language came thought of a different kind. The Ents began to think about themselves, about who they were and what they wanted, about the world beyond their forests and the creatures who inhabited it. This is when the Entwives appeared. Or perhaps I should say, this is when the Ents began to notice them. You see, the Entwives had always existed, just as the Ents had. But they were different. The Ents loved the great trees of the deep forest, the oaks and the beeches, the elms and the towering malorn trees that once threw in abundance throughout Middle-earth. They loved the wild places, the untamed forests where no axe had ever rung and no fire had ever burned. But the Entwives loved smaller things. They loved fruit trees and flowering bushes, gardens and orchards, the ordered beauty of things that grow in their proper places. For a long time, the Ents and the Entwives lived together in joy. They walked side by side through forests and gardens, and they were content. But slowly, so slowly that perhaps even they did not notice at first, they began to drift apart. The Ents remained in the deep forests, watching over their beloved trees, while the Entwives moved east, to the lands that would one day be called the Brown Lands, and there they made gardens of surpassing beauty. I saw those gardens once long ago, before the darkness came. They were magnificent, a patchwork of cultivated wonder stretching as far as the eye could see. The Entwives had taught the early men, who lived in those regions, how to tend the earth, how to grow grain and fruit, how to work with the land rather than against it. And the gardens flourished, and the Entwives were happy, and for a time all seemed well. But then came the War of the Last Alliance, when elves and men together marched against Sauron in Mordor. The Dark Lord's forces swept across the Brown Lands, and everything was destroyed. The gardens were burned, the earth was poisoned, and the Entwives vanished, gone, without a trace, without a word. The Ents searched for them. Oh, how they searched! They sent out calls in their rumbling voices, calls that echoed across mountains and rivers, but there was no answer. Only silence, only the wind in the dead grass, only the memory of what had been. Treebeard has never stopped searching. Even now, after 3,000 years and more, he still hopes. He still sends out his calls across the world, hoping that somewhere the Entwives might hear and respond. But they never do. Perhaps they were all destroyed in the war. Perhaps they fled to some distant land where even Ents cannot follow. Perhaps they sleep beneath the earth, waiting for a spring that will never come. No one knows. It is one of the great sorrows of this world, one of the wounds that will never fully heal. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you more of the Ents themselves, of their nature and their ways, for they are creatures unlike any other in Middle-earth. An Ent, you see, is not merely a tree that can walk and talk. An Ent is a shepherd, a guardian, a keeper of living things. Each Ent has a territory, a portion of the forest that is their particular care, and they know every territory as a farmer might know every cow in his herd. They know which trees are healthy and which are sick, which are young and growing, and which are old and ready to fall. They protect their trees from fire and storm, from disease and from creatures that would gnaw at roots or strip away bark. And the trees know them. This is the truly remarkable thing. the thing that those who have never walked among Ents find hardest to believe. The trees of an Entish forest are not like other trees. They are awake, or at least awakening. Stirred to something like consciousness by the presence of their shepherds. Some of them can move, slowly, so slowly that you might watch for a day and not see them change position. Some of them can speak, or at least make sounds that an Ent can understand. And some of them, the oldest and most watchful, have become what we call horns. Ah, the horns. These are a mystery even to me, and I have studied the ways of trees and forests for longer than you can imagine. A horn is a tree that has become almost Ent, or perhaps an Ent that has become almost tree-like. It is difficult to say which. They are dangerous, far more dangerous than the true Ents, for they have lost much of their patience and gained a terrible anger in its place. The horns remember every insult ever done to the forests, every tree cut down, every fire set, every act of wanton destruction. The horns remember it all, and they do not forgive. In the forest of Fangorn, where Treebeard makes his home, there are many horns. They lurk in the deep places, in the valleys where sunlight never reaches, in the tangled hollows where even Ents do not often go, and they wait for those who would enter the forest with axe or fire, with malice in their hearts. And when such people come, the horns rise up, and the forest closes in, and those who threaten the trees are never seen again. I have warned many travel about the forest of Fangorn, but few listen. They think they know better. They think their axes and their courage will protect them. They are wrong. The forest remembers everything, and it does not forgive. But let me tell you of Treebeard himself, for he is the greatest of all the Ents, and his story is worth the telling. When I first met Treebeard, it was in the early years of the Third Age, not long after the fall of Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance. The world was changing then, as it always changes, and the great forests were beginning to shrink. Men were spreading across Middle-earth, building their towns and cities, clearing land for farms and pastures, and the Ents were withdrawing, retreating into the few wild places that remained. I was walking through what is now called the Gap of Rohan, that broad pass between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, when I felt a presence watching me. Now, I am not easily startled, and I have faced many dangers in my long life, but there is something about being watched by an Ent that makes even a wizard pause. It is like being watched by the forest itself, by every tree and every leaf, by the earth beneath your feet and the sky above your head. You feel very small, very temporary mortal. I stopped walking and I waited, and eventually, Treebeard revealed himself. He was enormous, even then, taller than any tree I have ever seen, with arms like great branches and like the trunks of ancient oaks. His skin was rough and grey-green, like bark that has weathered 1,000 storms, and his eyes were the most remarkable thing about him. They were deep and brown and golden, filled with countless years of memory. And when he looked at me, I felt as though he could see right through me, past my grey robes and my worn staff, past the flesh and bone of this mortal form, right down to the spirit underneath. He spoke to me in Sindarin, the language of the grey elves, and his voice was like the rumbling of distant thunder mixed with the rustling of leaves. He said, and I remember his words exactly, for they're burned into my memory. He said, well, now what have we here? A walker, a wanderer, a seeker of paths. I know you, I think. I know the light that burns behind your eyes. You are one of the Mare, are you not? One of those who serve the great powers. Yes, I think I know you. I told him my name, or at least the name I was using in those days, and he laughed. An Ent's laughter is a remarkable sound, like stones grinding together mixed with the creaking of branches in a high wind. He said he had known me before, in another form, in another age, when the world was younger and the light was different. He did not explain what he meant, and I did not ask. There are some things that even wizards are not meant to know. We walked together for many days, Treebeard and I, and he told me the history of the Ents. He told me of the awakening, when the first Ents stirred to consciousness in forests that no longer exist. He told me of the teaching, when the elves gave them language and thought. He told me of the Entwives, and his voice grew heavy with sorrow, heavy as stone, heavy as the weight of all those empty years. And he told me of the slow retreat, the dwindling of the Ents, the shrinking of the forests, the fading of the old magic that had once filled the world. I asked him how many Ents were left, and he was silent for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was barely a whisper, a rustling of leaves in still air. He said that there were fewer every age, that some had gone to sleep and never awakened, that others had forgotten how to walk and had become trees themselves, rooted in one place forever. He said that the youngest Ent was already old beyond counting, for no Entings had been born since the Entwives vanished. Without the Entwives, there could be no more little Ents, and without little Ents, the race would eventually fade away entirely. This is one of the great tragedies of Middle-earth, you understand. The Ents are dying, slowly but surely fading into memory like so many other wonderful things. One day, perhaps not so far from now as we might hope, the last Ent will close his eyes and sleep, and he will not wake again. And then the trees will have no shepherds, no guardians, no one to tend them and protect them. They will stand alone against the axes and the fires, and there will be no one to speak for them. But I am being morbid, and that is not my way. Let me tell you instead of the marvels of Entish life, of the daily rituals that have continued unchanged since the beginning of the world. An Ent's day begins with the drinking of the waters. In the forest of Fangorn, and in other Entish places throughout Middle-earth, there are springs and streams that have a special quality. The water in these places carries something, a vitality, a force, that sustains the Ents in ways that ordinary water or food could not. Treebird calls this water Ent draught, and he is very particular about where it comes from and how it is collected. I want draught myself on more than one occasion, and I can tell you that it is unlike anything else in this world. It tastes of growing things, of roots and leaves and flowers, of rain and soil and sunlight. When you drink it, you feel as though something is waking up inside you, something green and patient and very, very old. Your thoughts slow down, they do not become less clear. Rather, they become more clear, more focused, like looking at the world through water that has been perfectly still for 1,000 years. After the morning draught, an Ent will walk the territory. This is a slow process, as everything with Ents is slow, and it may take many days to complete a single circuit. The Ent moves from tree to tree, speaking to each one in the old Entish tongue, listening to their concerns and complaints, noting which are flourishing and which are struggling. An unhealthy tree requires attention, perhaps a realignment of the soil around its roots, perhaps the removal of parasites or disease, perhaps simply the comfort of an Entish presence. The Ents know their trees as you might know your own family, and they care for them just as tenderly. In the afternoon, if there is afternoon in a forest so thick that day and night blur together, an Ent might meet with other Ents to discuss matters of importance. This is where the famous Entmoot comes in, those long meetings where Ents gather to make decisions. An Entmoot can last for days or weeks, for Ents do not believe in hasty decisions. Every aspect of a question must be examined, every possibility considered, every voice heard. And when a decision is finally reached, it is reached by consensus, with everything in agreement. I attended an Entmoot once, long ago, and it was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my very long life. Imagine a clearing in the deep forest, ringed by trees so old that they remember the first dawn. Imagine dozens of Ents gathered there, each one unique, each one shaped by the trees they have tended for thousands of years. Some looked like oaks, broad and strong and stubborn. Others looked like beeches, tall and silvery and wise. Still others looked like no tree I had ever seen, twisted and ancient and strange. They spoke in Old Entish, which I understand only a little, and the sound of their voices was like a symphony of natural sounds, like wind and water and rustling leaves, all woven together to something coherent. They debated, though to debate is too hasty a word for what they did. They considered, they pondered, they turned the question over and examining it from every angle, letting it rest and then picking it up again. And eventually, after what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a week or so, they reached their decision. The matter at hand was a relatively small one, something to do with the boundary between two Ents territories and a particular grove of young trees that both claimed the right to tend. In the end, they decided to tend it together, sharing the responsibility, and both Ents seemed satisfied with this outcome. But the process was the thing. I learned more about patience and deliberation in that week than I had learned in centuries of dealing with elves and men. Now I have spoken much of the Ents, but you asked also about the nature spirits, and there is much to say on that subject as well. For the Ents are only one kind of spirit among many, and the forests of Mid-Earth are home to beings far stranger and more mysterious. Take the river spirits, for instance. Every major river in Middle-earth has its spirit, its guardian, its personification of the water's will. The Anduin has Goldberry's father, the river spirit of the Withywindle, though he dwells far from the main flow of that great river. The Brandywine has its own spirit, quieter and more secretive than most. And the rivers that flow down from the mountains, the Brunnen and the Silverlode and the Celebrant, these have spirits of extraordinary power. Bound up with the magic of the elven realms they flow through. I have spoken with river spirits on occasion, though it is not easy. They think in ways that are utterly unlike the Thorves or elves or men. For then everything is flow and change, the constant movement of water from mountains to sea. They do not understand stillness, cannot comprehend the idea of staying in one place. Even when they take physical form, which they rarely do, they cannot hold it for long. They shimmer and shift, always in motion, like reflections on moving water. The river spirit of the Brunnen, who serves errand of Rivendell, once told me something that I have never forgotten, she said, and I translate as best I can, that the mountains are the memories of the earth, and the rivers are its dreams. The mountains remember everything that has ever happened, unchanging, permanent, solid. But the rivers, they imagine what might happen, what could happen, what will happen. They flow always forward, always toward the sea, always toward the great waters where all rivers become one. I asked her what the sea was in this metaphor, and she laughed. A river spirit's laugh is like the sound of water over rocks, musical and wild. She said that the sea was death and rebirth, the ending that is also a beginning, the place where all waters mingle, and then rise again as rain and snow to fall upon the mountains and begin their journey once more. It was a beautiful thought, and I have carried it with me ever since. Then there are the stone spirits, though these are rare and harder to find. The mountains of Middle-earth were shaped by Or the Smith, he who created the dwarves, and Or put something of himself into every peak and ridge and boulder. The stone spirits are that something, the awareness that lurks within the rock, the slow thoughts of geological time. I have never spoken with a stone spirit directly, for their thoughts are too slow even for me. A single word from a stone spirit might take a century to complete, but I have felt their presence. In the deep places of the misty mountains, in the ancient halls of Khazad, in the roots of the mountains where fire and stone meet in eternal conflict. They are aware, these stone spirits, but their awareness is so different from ours that communication is nearly impossible. The dwarves, interestingly, have developed ways of working with stone spirits over the long ages. Their greatest works of craftsmanship, the wonders that other races can barely comprehend, are made in cooperation with the spirits of the stone itself. A master dwarven smith does not simply shape the stone, he listens to it, learns what it wants to become, and helps it achieve that form. This is why dwarven works are so durable, so beautiful, so seemingly alive. They are alive in a sense. The stone spirit within them has been awakened, has been given purpose, has been helped to become what it was always meant to be. And then there are the wind spirits, perhaps the strangest of all. The winds are man's domain, and the spirits that ride them are his servants, carrying messages across the world, bringing weather where it is needed, watching over the land from heights that no other being can reach. I have ridden with wind spirits on occasion, when speed was of the essence and no other transportation would serve. It is an exhilarating experience, but also a terrifying one. The wind has no patience for earthbound concerns. It blows where it will, as fast as thought, as free as imagination. The eagles of man are distant cousins of these wind spirits, or perhaps vessels of them to use when they wish to take physical form. The great eagles are not mere birds, as some who have not met them might suppose. They are intelligent, proud, fierce, and absolutely loyal to the elder king. When man wishes to see what is happening in Middle-earth, he sends his eagles. When he wishes to intervene directly in the affairs of the world, the eagles are his instruments. I have called upon the eagles more than once in times of dire need, and they have always come, though not always happily. They do not appreciate being used as transportation, and they are quick to remind anyone who asks for their help that they serve man, not wizards or elves or anyone else. But when the cause is just and the need is great, they will help. They have helped me escape from dangers that would certainly have meant my end, and I am grateful to them beyond words. But let me return to the forests and the spirits that dwell there, for there is still much to tell. In the old forest, which lies between the Shire and the Barrow Downs, their lives are being called Tom Bombadil. I have known Tom for as long as I have walked in Middle-earth, and I still do not fully understand what he is. He appears as an old man, jolly and round, with bright blue eyes and a fondness singing nonsense songs. But beneath that cheerful exterior lies a power that even I find difficult to comprehend. Tom calls himself the eldest, and he says that he was here before the rivers and the trees, before the seas and the mountains, before the first raindrop fell. He remembers darkness, he says, before the stars were made. If this is true, and I have no reason to doubt him, then Tom Bombadil is older than the Ents, older than the elves, older than almost anything else in this world. He may like myself, one who took physical form so long ago that he has forgotten his origins. Or he may be something else entirely, something unique, something that the songs of creation made as an afterthought or a mystery. What I can tell you is that Tom has power over all things within his borders. The old forest obeys him utterly. Old Man Willow, that ancient and malevolent tree who delights in trapping unwary travelers, becomes docile as a kitten when Tom speaks to him. The paths in the forest, which twist and change and lead travelers in circles, become straight and clear when Tom walks them. Even the Barrow Wights, those terrible spirits of the dead who haunt the downs beyond the forest, fear Tom and will not enter his domain. And yet Tom has no interest in the wider world. He will not leave his borders, will not involve himself in the great affairs of elves and men and wizards. He tends his forest and loves his Goldberry, the river daughter who is his wife, and he sings his songs and lives his life as he has done since the beginning of time. The One Ring itself has no power over him. I have seen him hold it, laugh at it, make it disappear and reappear with the ease of a children's game. The ring cannot tempt him, cannot corrupt him, cannot even interest him. He is outside its power, outside the power of Sarn, outside perhaps even the power of the Valor themselves. Goldberry is another mystery. She is a river spirit, or the daughter unborn from the waters of the Withy Wind. She shines like sunlight on water, like rain falling on flowers, like all the beauty of the natural world made manifest in a single form. When she speaks, her voice is like music, and when she laughs, you feel as though spring has come early. Tom loves her completely, utterly, without reservation, and she loves him the same way. Theirs is a love that has lasted since before the mountains rose, and it will last until the world is unmade and remade anew. I stayed with Tom and Goldberry for a time many years ago, when I was weary and needed rest. Their house is a refuge from all the troubles of the world, a place where evil cannot enter and worry cannot find you. I ate their food and drank their wine and listened to their songs, and for a little while I forgot about the darkness that was gathering in the east, forgot about my duties and my responsibilities, forgot everything except the simple joy of being alive in a beautiful place with kind companions. But I could not stay forever. My path lay elsewhere, out into the troubled world, and eventually I had to leave. Tom understood. He always understands. He walked with me to the edge of his domain, singing as went, and at the boundary he stopped and waved goodbye. "Come back when you can," he said. "The door will always be open, and the kettle will always be ready for tea." I have not been back since, but I know the invitation still stands. With Tom, such things do not expire. Now let me speak of another kind of forest spirit, one that is darker and more dangerous than any I have mentioned so far. In the great forest of Mirkwood, which was once called Greenwood the Great before the shadow fell upon it, there are spirits that serve the darkness. These are not spirits of nature as the Ents are, not guardians of growing things. These are corrupted beings, twisted by the malice of the necromancer who dwelt in Dol Guldur, turned from their original purposes to serve evil ends. The spiders of Mirkwood are one manifestation of this corruption. They are descendants of Ungoliant, the terrible spirit of darkness who helped Morgoth destroy the 2 trees of Valinor. Ungoliant was not truly a spider, but she took that form because it suited her nature, patient and predatory and utterly without mercy. Her children spread across Middle-earth, and the greatest of them came to Mirkwood, where they grew fat on the darkness that emanated from the necromancer's tower. But the spiders are not the only dark spirits in Mirkwood. There are things in those shadows that have no names, that were never meant to have form, that existed as pure malevolence before they were given shape by evil will. I have encountered these beings on my journeys through that forest, and I can tell you that they are more terrible than any Or, troll or dragon. They do not fight with weapons or claws or teeth. They fight with fear, with despair, with the slow draining away of hope and strength and will. The elves of Mirkwood, who dwell the northern part of the forest under King Thranduil, have learned to live with these dark spirits. They know which paths are safe and which are dangerous, which glades to avoid and which streams to never drink from. They have set up barriers of light and song around their realm, barriers that the dark spirits cannot easily cross. And they fight, always fight, pushing back against the shadows that would otherwise swallow the entire forest. I have helped them in this fight on occasion. The power I carry is anathema to such spirits, a fire that burns away darkness wherever it shines. But I cannot be everywhere, and the forest is vast, and the darkness is patient. It will wait 1,000 years for an opportunity. And when that opportunity comes, it will strike without warning or mercy. This is why the Ents are so important, you see, not just as shepherds of trees, but as bastions against the darkness. An Entish forest cannot be corrupted in the way that Mirkwood was corrupted. The presence of the Ents, their ancient power, their connection to the light that was before the sun and moon, this keeps the darkness at bay. When the Ents sleep, when they fade, when they are no longer there to guard the forests, the darkness will come creeping in. Tree by tree, shadow by shadow, until the whole world is Mirkwood, and there is no green or growing thing left untouched by evil. But enough of darkness. Let me tell you of something more pleasant, of the relationship between Ents and elves, 2 of the oldest races in Middle-earth. The elves and the Ents have been friends since the very beginning, since the elves first taught the Ents to speak. They share a love of growing things, a patience that other races find incomprehensible, a memory of the world when it was young, beautiful, and full of light. In the ancient days, elves would often dwell in Entish forests, building their homes among the branches of trees that the Ents tended. And the Ents would come to elvish festivals, standing at the edges of the clearings, their deep eyes watching the dancing and the singing with something that might have been joy. The elves of Lothlorien, who were perhaps the most tree-loving of all the elven peoples, maintained close relations with the Ents until relatively recently. The Lady Galadriel, who rules that realm with her husband Spoborn, has spoken with Treebird many times over the ages. She has drunk Ent, draught and walked the paths of Fangorn Forest, and she says that the Ents are the purest expression of human love that still exists in Middle-earth. But the relationship has cooled in recent centuries. The elves are leaving Middle-earth, sailing west to the Undying Lands, and those who remain are increasingly withdrawn, focused on preserving what they have rather than reaching out to others. And the Ents, for their part, have become more isolated, more suspicious of all who are not Ents. The loss of the Entwives has made them wary, fearful of forming attachments that might be broken. So the ancient friendship endures, but it is not what it once was. The dwarves, on the other hand, have never been friends with the Ents. This is hardly surprising, given that the dwarves love to cut down trees for their forges and their mines. The Ents see the dwarves as destroyers, as axe-wielders, as enemies of everything green and growing. And the dwarves see the Ents as obstacles, as dangerous forest creatures who threaten their operations. There have been clashes between the two races over the ages, and there is little love lost on either side. I have tried occasionally to mediate between them. I have explained to the dwarves that the Ents are not mindless trees, intelligent beings with as much right to exist as any other race. And I have explained to the Ents that the dwarves are not wantonly destructive but craftsmen, who need wood for their works, just as they need stone and metal. But neither side is particularly interested in listening. The grudge runs too deep, the wounds are too old, and I doubt it will ever truly heal. Men are a different matter entirely. The Ents regard men with a mixture of bewilderment and sorrow. They bewildered because men are so hasty, so short-lived, so able to think in the long terms that Ents find natural. And they are sorrowful because men are, more than any other race, responsible for the destruction of the forests. Men cut and burn, clear and plant, reshape the world according to the needs without thought for what was there before. And yet, the Ents remember that it was men whom the Entwives taught, men who learned from them the arts of agriculture and gardening. The Entwives loved men, in their way, loved their energy and their curiosity and their determination to make things grow. If the Entwives could love men, then perhaps the Ents should try to understand them, should try to see them as something other than destroyers. Treebeard, for all his age and wisdom, still struggles with this. He has seen too many forests fall to the axes of men. He has watched too many of his trees die screaming, burned or chopped or poisoned by human activity. When he speaks of men, his voice grows hard as ancient wood, and there is something in his eyes that might be anger, might be grief, might be both. But he has also seen men who love trees, who plant rather than cut, who understand the importance of forests and work to protect them. He has met rangers who spend their lives guarding the wild places, foresters who tend their woods as carefully as any Ent tends his territory. And when he speaks of these men, his voice softens, and there is hope in his eyes, hope that perhaps not all of humanity is lost to the axe and the fire. Let me tell you now of the Entmoot that preceded the fall of Isengard, for it is a tale worth knowing and one that illustrates much about the nature of the Ents. Saruman was once a lad like myself, one of the Istari sent to Middle-earth to oppose Sauron. But Saruman fell into evil, seduced by his own pride and his desire for power. He turned to the dark arts, to machinery and industry, and he began to build an army of orcs in his fortress of Isengard. And to fuel his forges and his war machines, he cut down the trees of Fangorn forest. Now, Fangorn has always been a dangerous for woodcutters. The Horns do not take kindly to axes, and many who entered the forest never returned. But Saruman's orcs were numerous and well armed, and they did not go into the deep forest where the most dangerous trees lurked. Instead, they cut the edges, the younger trees, the groves that bordered Saruman's domain. And the Ents watched, and the Ents remembered. Treebeard was first to truly understand what was happening. He had lived beside Isengard for many ages, and he had seen Saruman come and go, watched the wizard's activities with the patience of his kind. But when the cutting began in earnest, when the smoke from Saruman's forges darkened the sky, and the screams of dying trees echoed through the forest, Treebeard knew that something had to be done. He called an Entmoot, the first in many years. From all corners of the forest they came, the ancient Ents, walking slowly through the trees to the meeting place. Some had not moved in decades, had stood so still that moss had grown over them and birds had nested in their branches. But they came when Treebird called, for his voice carried the weight of desperate urgency, and even Ents could recognize when haste was necessary. The Entmoot lasted 3 days, 3 days of debate and deliberation, of slow words and careful thought. The question before them was simple. Should they march to war against Saruman? But the implications were complex. The Ents had not fought a war in centuries. Many of them were wary, ready to sleep and never wake, and war against a wizard, even a fallen wizard, was no small thing. Saruman had power, had armies, had weapons of fire and steel that could kill even the oldest Ent. But the memory of the trees weighed heavily upon them. Every Ent there had lost trees to Saruman's axes. Every Ent there had felt the pain of their children falling, had heard the screams of wood and sap and leaf as the fires consumed them. And there was another feeling too, something that Ents rarely allow themselves to feel, on anger. Ent anger is a terrible thing to behold. It builds slowly, over years or decades or centuries, accumulating like water behind a dam, and when it finally breaks loose, it is unstoppable, irresistible, a force of nature as primal and powerful as any earthquake or hurricane. The Ents of Fangorn had been building their anger for too long, and now it was ready to be released. On the 3rd day, the Entmoot reached a decision. They would march. They would march to Isengard, and they would tear down what Saruman had built, and they would make him pay for every tree he had murdered. And when the decision was announced, a sound rose from the gathered Ents, a sound that I wish I could have heard. It was the war song of the Ents, the battle cry of the forest awakened. It had not been sung in 3,000 years, not since the War of the Last Alliance. But every Ent knew the words, knew the melody, knew the rhythm that spoke of roots and branches, of growth and destruction, of the ancient power that sleeps in every green and growing thing. They marched through the night, the Ents, and the horns marched with them. The forest itself seemed to be moving, trees uprooting themselves to follow the shepherds, shadows deepening as the anger of the green world gathered for war. By dawn they had reached Isengard, and by noon the assault begun. I was not there to witness what happened next, but I have heard the accounts from those who were. The hobbits Merry and Pippin, who had befriended Treebeard in the forest, watched from a distance as the Ents attacked. They said it was like watching a dam break, like seeing a flood sweep away everything in its path. The walls of Isengard, which seemed so strong and permanent, were torn apart like paper. The gates, which no army could have breached, were ripped from their hinges and thrown aside. The orcs who tried to fight were crushed, trampled, torn limb from limb by creatures who had held their anger for centuries and were now finally gloriously letting it go. Saruman fled to his tower, Orthanc, which was built of a stone so hard that even Ents could not break it. And there he stayed, trapped, as the Ents diverted the river and flooded his underground works, drowning his forges and his machinery, turning his fortress into a lake. It was a victory, a complete and total victory, achieved without the help of armies, or wizards, or any of the other forces that were gathering to oppose Sauron. But it came at a cost. Ents died in that battle, burned by Saruman's fires, crushed by falling stones, killed by the weapons of his horse. Each death was a tragedy, for Ents do not reproduce anymore. And every Ent who dies is gone forever, irreplaceable, a piece of the world's history lost for all time. Treebird mourned each one, spoke their names in the old Entish tongue, the planted trees in their memory. The victory was real, but so was the grief. And after the battle, the Ents did not go home immediately. They stayed to tend the land, to undo some of the damage Saruman had done. They planted new trees where the old ones had been cut, healed the wounded earth, cleaned the poisoned streams. It was slow work, but Ents are used to slow work. They had all the time in the world, or at least all the time that remained to them. I visited them there, after the war was over, after Sauron had fallen and the ring had been destroyed. I walked among the new plantings, admired the young trees that were already reaching toward the sky. Treebeard greeted me with something that might have been a smile, though it is difficult to tell with Ents. The forest will grow again, he said. It will take centuries, but it will grow, and we will be here to tend it for as long as we can. I asked him about the future, about what would happen when the Ents finally faded, when there were no more shepherds to tend the trees. He was silent for a long time, so long that I thought perhaps he would not answer. But finally he spoke, his voice heavy with ages of memory and sorrow. The trees will remember us, he said. They will remember once there were beings who cared for them, who spoke to them, who walked among them as friends. And perhaps someday, when the world has changed and changed again, new shepherds will arise, not Ents perhaps, but something like us, something that understands, something that cares. It was a hopeful thought, and I have held on to it in the years since. The Ents may fade, as all things fade, but the forests will remain. The trees will continue to grow, reaching toward the sun, sinking their roots deep into the earth. And somewhere in those forests, in the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches, the spirit of the Ents will endure. Now, there is one more thing I wish to tell you about. One more aspect of the nature spirits that I have not yet touched upon. And that is the question of corruption, of what happens when spirits of nature are turned to darkness. I have mentioned the spiders of Mirkwood and the dark things that lurk in the shadows of that forest. But there are other examples, older and more terrible, that illustrate the danger of corrupted nature spirits. In the first age, before the sun and moon rose, before men awoke in the east, there was a war between the Valar and Morgoth, the original Dark Lord of whom Sauron was merely a servant. This war reshaped the world, destroyed entire continents, changed the very nature of existence, and in this war, Morgoth corrupted everything he could touch, bending it to his evil will. He corrupted elves, twisting them into orcs, creatures of darkness and cruelty. He corrupted men, filling them with pride and fear and hatred. He corrupted Maya, turning them into demons and monsters and things that have no names. And he corrupted spirits of nature, taking beings that had been created to nurture and protect, and turning them into instruments of destruction. The dragons are one result of this corruption. They were made from fire spirits, or perhaps from spirits of greed and acquisition, twisted and given form by Morgoth's malice. The Balrogs are another Maya who were corrupted so thoroughly that they became creatures of shadow and flame, burning everything they touched. But there are subtler corruptions too, corruptions that do not create new monsters, but simply is existing spirits away from their purposes. A river spirit that has been corrupted might flood without reason, drowning villages and farms. A wind spirit might become a hurricane, destroying everything in its path. A spirit of growing things might become a spirit of thorns and poison, making forests that are deadly to all who enter. The old man willow in the old forest is an example of this kind of corruption. Though I am not certain whether he was always evil or whether something twisted him over the ages. He is ancient, one of the oldest trees in Middle-earth, and he has grown bitter and angry and malevolent. He lures travelers to him with drowsy whispers and soft songs, and then he traps them in his roots, slowly digesting them, feeding on the life force. Tom Bombadil keeps Old Man Willow in check, but only within his borders. Beyond the old forest there are other trees like him, other spirits that have been corrupted or have simply grown too old and too angry to remember what they were supposed to be. The world is full of such dangers, full of ancient powers that have lost their way, and now pose a threat to all who encounter them. This is why the Ents are so important, one more reason among many. They remember what the spirits of nature are supposed to be. They keep the forest healthy, tend the trees, maintain the ancient balance that keeps the darkness at bay. When an Ent tends a tree, the tree is less likely to become corrupted, less likely to turn toward evil. The Ent's presence is a reminder of the light, of the purpose for which all growing things were created. And this is why the fading of the Ents is such a tragedy, why I mourn their passing even as I celebrate their long history. Without them, the forests will be more vulnerable, more susceptible to corruption. The darkness will creep in, one tree at a time, one spirit at a time, until the green places of the world are no longer places of refuge, but places of danger. But I have spoken long enough of dark things. Let me end with something brighter, with a story of hope and renewal. After the War of the Ring, when Sauron was defeated and the shadow lifted from the land, strange things began to happen in the forests of Middle-earth. Trees that had been still for centuries began to move. Streams that had been fouled began to run clean. Animals that had fled returned to their homes. It was as if the land itself was waking up, shaking off the darkness that had weighed it down for so long. The Ents felt this awakening more keenly than anyone. Treebeard told me that he could sense a change in the air, a lightening of the spirit that he had not felt in ages. The trees were happier, he said, more eager to grow, more inclined to reach toward the light. And the young Ents, if one could call them that, the trees that had been tended so long and so carefully that they had begun to awaken. These were stirring too, moving more freely, speaking more clearly. I asked Treebeard if he thought this might mean the return of the Entwives, if perhaps they had been hiding somewhere and would now emerge to rejoin their partners. He was silent for a long time, his great eyes clouded with hope and fear and sorrow all mixed together. Finally he said that he did not know, that he dared not hope, that hope was too painful when it had been disappointed so many times before. But there was something in his voice that told me he was hoping anyway, that despite everything he still believed that someday, somehow the Entwives might come home. I have not seen evidence that they have returned, not in all the years since the war ended, but I have heard rumors, whispers from travelers who have passed through the distant lands to the east. They speak of forests where no forest should be, of green valleys in the midst of wastelands, of gardens that tend themselves, no gardener in sight. Perhaps these are only stories. Perhaps they are misunderstandings, natural explanations for unusual phenomena. But perhaps, just perhaps, they are the gods growing new gardens, tending new trees, waiting for the time when they might return to their old loves. I choose to believe the latter, not because I have evidence, but because the world needs such hope. The Ents need such hope. Treebeard needs such hope. After all the ages of sorrow and loss, after all the trees that have fallen and all the forests that have shrunk, there must be something to look forward to. Something to keep the ancient shepherds walking through their woods, something to give meaning to their endless vigil. And so I end my tale as I began it, with the Ents. They are walking still, somewhere in the forests of Middle-earth, tending their trees, speaking their slow words, remembering the light that was before the sun and moon. They will continue walking until they can walk no more, until the last of them lays down beneath the trees he has tended and becomes one with the forest forever. But their story does not end with them. The trees they have tended will continue to grow. The forests they have protected will continue to stand, and somewhere in the rustle of leaves, in the creak of branches, in the whisper of wind through ancient woods, their voices will continue to be heard, speaking of patience and wisdom, and the enduring power of growing things. This is what the Ents have taught me, in all my long years of knowing them. That the world is slow to change, but does change, always inevitably. That patience is not passivity, but a form of action, a way of working with time rather than against it. That every living thing has a voice, if only we take the time to listen. And that even in the darkest times, when all seems lost and hope is merely a memory, the green things continue to grow, reaching always toward the light. Remember this when you walk through forests or sit beneath trees or tend your own small garden. You are not alone. The spirits of nature are all around you, in the water you drink and the air you breathe, in the earth beneath your feet and the sky above your head. They are watching, listening, waiting. And if you are patient, if you are kind, if you take the time to truly see and hear and understand, they might just speak to you too. The fire is burning low now, and the night grows late. But before I end, let me tell you one more thing. One last secret that I learned from the Ents, and have never shared with anyone before. The oldest Ents, the ones who remember the time before time, They know something that the rest of us do not. They know that this world, this Middle Earth, is not the only world. They know that there are other worlds, other places where trees grow and rivers flow, spirits tend the growing things. And they know that when their time in this world is done, when the last Ent finally sleeps and does not wake, they will not simply end. They will go somewhere else, somewhere green and beautiful, somewhere where the Ent wives are waiting. This is not doctrine, not theology, not something that can be proven or disproven. It is simply what the oldest Ents believe, what they have believed since the beginning of time. And when Treebeard speaks of it, his voice loses its heaviness, its way to ages and sorrow. He sounds almost young again, almost hopeful. Almost like an Ent who still has everything to look forward to. I do not know if this belief is true. I am a wizard, not a prophet, and the fate of souls is not my domain. But I know that Treebeard believes it, and I know that his belief brings him comfort. And in a world so full of darkness and sorrow, comfort is not something to be dismissed lightly. So sleep now, my friend, and dream of forests. Dream of trees that touch the sky and roots that reach to the center of the earth. Dream of shedstones walking through the green twilight, speaking in voices like wind and water, tending the world as it was always meant to be tended. And when you wake, go out into the world and be kind to the growing things. Plant a tree, tend a garden, walk through a forest with quiet feet and ears. This is how we honor the Ents. This is how we keep their memory alive. The spirits of nature are all around us, always have been, always will be. May we have the wisdom to see them, the patience to understand them, and the courage to protect them for all the ages yet to come. And now the fire has burned to embers, and the night is deep around us. I have spoken long, perhaps too long, but such is the way of old wizards with tales to tell. The Ents would understand. They speak for hours, days, weeks, letting their stories unfold at the pace of growing things. I have tried to do them justice, to capture some small part of their wisdom and wonder in my poor words. Go now, and remember what I have told you. Remember the Ents, the shepherds of the trees. Remember the nature spirits, the rivers and winds and stones, and all the countless beings who share this world with us. Remember that we are not the only thinking things in creation, that the world is alive in ways we barely comprehend, that every forest and every stream and every mountain has its own story to tell. And perhaps if you are very lucky, you might meet an Ent yourself someday. If you do, be patient, be kind, be willing to listen whatever you do. Do not be hasty. The Ents have been here since the beginning of the world. They have seen everything, remembered everything, understood things that we can barely imagine. They deserve our respect, our admiration, and our gratitude, for without the Ents, the forests would be merely trees, and without the forests, the world would be merely rock and water. And without the spirits who tend and guard and cherish all these things, we would be alone in a universe that cares nothing for our hopes and dreams. But we are not alone. We have never been alone. The spirits are with us, have always been with us, will always be with us. And that, more than anything else, is the gift that the Ents and the nature spirits give to us. The knowledge that we are part of something greater, something older, something that will endure long after we ourselves have passed from this world. Now the story is told, and the fire is ash, and outside I can hear the wind in the trees. Listen to it. That is the voice of the world speaking to anyone who cares to hear. It has been speaking since the first tree raised its branches to the sky, and it will go on speaking until the last tree falls. May you always have ears to hear it. May you always have the wisdom to understand, and may the blessing of the Ents, the ancient shepherds of the forest, be upon you, now and forever. That is my tale. That is what I know of the Ents and the nature spirits, of the shepherds who walk in the deep places, and the beings who dwell in river and stone and wind. It is incomplete, as all tales are incomplete, for the world is vast and my knowledge is limited. But it is true as any words can be, spoken from one who has walked among these wonders and marveled at them all long life. The dawn is coming now. I can see its first grey light creeping through the window, touching the edges of things with the promise of a new day. And somewhere out there, in forests that still stand and rivers that still flow and mountains that still reach toward the sky, the spirits are stirring, waking to another day of their endless watch. May we be worthy of their guardianship. May we learn from their patience, and may we remember always that we share this world with beings far older and wiser than ourselves. Beings who have been here since the beginning and will be here, in some form until the end. Go now, go out into the world and see it with new eyes. And when you pass through a forest or beside a river under the shadow of a mountain, pause for a moment. Listen. Feel, remember. The spirits are there. They have always been there. And they are waiting to be remembered.